I'm living in Brooklyn, and I go to the NYU bookstore and buy my grandfather's autobiography. And as I'm reading it on my way home, I have a shock, and one of those things that it's like brings goosebumps to my entire body. And that's the first sentence of his autobiography says that his father owned a grocery store near Prospect Park on Bergen Street in Brooklyn. And now here I was, a kid from Portland, Oregon, who was living on Bergen Street in Brooklyn, reading my grandfather's autobiography for the first time and realizing that he grew up where I lived, and I didn't even know it. I didn't know a thing about him. It blew my mind.
Bellman had this ability to face uncertainty with complete confidence.
His attitude was, if you couldn't represent and reason about the problem with the mathematics at hand, then you invented some more mathematics.
There are not very many people who have had professorships in 3 departments. He was in mathematics, medicine, and electrical engineering.
He didn't sleep very well because he'd get these ideas, and 2 o'clock in the morning he was up writing his articles. I think he's probably one of the greatest geniuses that ever lived.
This is the film I was born to make. Not like metaphorically or figuratively, this is literally the film I was born to make. I would not have been able to make this film if it weren't for my grandfather. So I left New York and flew to Los Angeles to learn about my grandfather, Richard Bellman. The idea was it would be a good project to work on with my father. I spent over 10 years filming this movie. This was my first trip to LA in 1999.
All right, I just landed, and gonna meet my dad. He's picking me up, and we're gonna start the filming.
At the beginning of filming, I could say that my father and I had always been extremely close. That was going to be tested.
Hey, there he is. Hey, Dad.
Great to see you.
See you.
All right, cool. Welcome to LA.
You know, I'm making a documentary about my grandfather, but he's not in it. He's dead. He's been dead for 25 years. My father and his father had a complicated relationship. I knew that my grandfather had died without making peace with my father, but I wasn't sure why.
Sons of famous men very often have very hard times living up to the images and expectations, and also the lack of attention.
Richard Bellman is one of the great mathematicians in history. He invented the field of dynamic programming, and he pioneered artificial intelligence and the use of computers to solve real-world problems. It's kind of like removing the curtain behind the Wizard of Oz or something. Like, you don't realize it's just a man back there. I think a lot of people probably feel that way about their fathers, that they're these superhero figures that they do all these great things. And I had known my father to be such a great healer and such a great processor of emotions. I hadn't really seen the things that pushed his emotional buttons that he had been working on since he was a kid.
I wasn't the trophy kid he wanted me to be. I wasn't the arrow that he could shoot into the future with the essence of him, but in the way I am. What I've learned over the years is how difficult it was not being Richard Bellman.
Dick didn't want to compete with Eric. He said, do anything you want with your life except be a mathematician, because it's very unlikely that you're going to be better at mathematics than I am. So do something else where you excel in your own field by yourself. Be your own person. That's what he wanted.
But there's this thing about competing with your dad and being your own man. And he wanted me to be a famous scientist. And I really would have been good at science, but it's like, you know, guys, some kids grow up, their fathers are famous insurance salesmen or stockbrokers, and they're rich, and you can go, well, I can make money. My dad developed the H-bomb. And it's like, where do you go from there? I mean, neutron bomb? I mean, the whole concept. And then I was growing up in the 60s where I didn't want to develop bombs and missile delivery systems. And, you know, of course, he developed all these other applications afterwards to compensate for it. But it was like, you know, I was told by my mother, he's the greatest genius in the history of the world or something. And it was like, how could I possibly meet those standards?
Where are the keys, Dad? I got it. Alright. Grab my stuff.
Woke up 25 minutes ago, running 10 minutes late going to LA on a hot smoky day in the summer to film.
How are you?
Good.
Nice seeing you. Haven't changed a bit, kid.
Oh man, good to see you.
Gabe?
Yeah. What do you think his biggest gift was?
I think his involvement with medicine, integrating mathematics and medicine, was revolutionary.
I think his mathematical ability, definitely.
His ability to do mathematics.
It was his talent for mathematics.
That as a problem solver, I don't think there was anybody that was better than him.
I know he was a wonderful teacher.
It wasn't just that he could create amazing ideas, but he could communicate those ideas. It was an amazing gift. He wrote 695 papers, and he wrote over 40 books.
His intelligence.
Strength.
His many books were translated into every language in the world practically, and so, you know, he influenced millions of people.
Richard Bellman was the only child of John James Bellman and Pearl Safian Bellman. His grandparents had emigrated from Kiev, and as best as anybody could tell, were Russian, Jewish, and Armenian, although the last name Bellman was Swedish.
Here's a Jewish kid from Brooklyn who just idolized the notion of being sort of like an English aristocrat.
He had great aspirations to leave behind his childhood, where his father was a grocery man, spoke with an accent.
Richard Bellman went to high school at Abraham Lincoln High School in Brooklyn, and he went to Brooklyn College.
At Brooklyn College, there are a lot of smart people, and you don't get to be captain of command team unless you have a certain talent. And he had that talent.
From there, he went to Princeton, where he got his PhD in 3 months. That is the shortest time anybody has ever received a PhD in the history of Princeton.
He was one of the bright boys from Brooklyn. You mostly work on things that everybody else thinks are stupid. And when you get something right, it's really good.
So he didn't get great grades in undergrad. I mean, he almost flunked chemistry because he hated the lab. But he told me that the only reason he passed chemistry is he would sit next to the smartest girl in the class, he'd bump into her, photographic memory, photograph the whole page, put down the answers. He just wanted to pass. And then his group at Brooklyn College won the national mathematical intercollegiate contest. So he came in and the professor said, "You?" Pointed the picture of him in the school paper. He thought he was an idiot.
As he grew up and needed money, he earned it by gambling. He was so much brighter than these elderly gentlemen. And they would say, oh, come on, this kid can't beat us. But then he would proceed to do it.
His father was a taskmaster and really pushed his brilliant son, where he had to hang up his clothes in the right order, facing the right direction in the closet.
It wasn't just a hate-hate relationship. And when his father was dying in a VA hospital, bad heart, he would go up to see him and so on regularly in the Bronx.
In his autobiography, my grandfather describes hearing about the death of his father the following way. The next day I received a telegram. My father was dead. This was a shock, since I had not been prepared for this either by him or by any doctor there. Although by this time my father and I were not very close. I was saddened. I was saddened not so much by the loss as by the waste. I knew well what my father could have been, what a great potential he had.
What were your lasting impressions?
Sort of just had one foot in reality and the rest of him was in a world of thought and ideas.
Incredibly disciplined.
Very determined man.
His intelligence.
It was just so different to see someone who was, that good at solving problems.
My grandfather worked for RAND, Research in Nuclear Development, off and on for 15 years. All of the work he did there was highly classified, but he developed the field of dynamic programming and his theories on embedding while working there.
So, this is RAND, huh?
Yeah. Research in Nuclear Development. Santa Monica Courthouse.
We don't allow cameras on the property, so you're getting a rare look, and then I'm going to ask you to go.
Okay.
Okay?
Project RAND was a Air Force project that eventually became a think tank known as the RAND Corporation.
RAND was full of intellectuals looking for chinks in each other's armor. Now, he said as far as dynamic programming went, he said that was in the wind. He said, and if he hadn't gotten there first, he and Stuart Dreyfus worked on that. Stuart used the great big Johnny-Ack computer at RAND at night when nobody else was around. And Dick said that if he and Stu hadn't done it at the time, he said somebody else would have come up with that theory. He said, but as far as invariant embedding is concerned, he said he kind of thinks that's unique. He said he wasn't sure that anybody else would have ever thought of it.
The world is full of problems where what is required of the person making the decision is not to just face a static situation and make one single decision, but to make a sequence of decisions as a situation evolves. If you stop to think about it, almost everything in the world falls in that category. So that's the kind of problem the dynamic programming addressed. The principle on which it's based is such an intuitively obvious principle that it drives some mathematicians crazy, because it's really kind of impossible to prove it. It's an intuitive principle, and pure mathematicians don't like intuition.
It's a fairly simple criterion. It basically says that the shortest path can be done in steps. So that the shortest path from here to New York is the shortest path from here to the closest place to New York, and then the path from there to New York. The main effect was to show that a problem that looked like it was too hard isn't. It's a way of adjusting a problem so that it can be solved, rather than changing the nature of the computation.
So this principle of optimality, why would you ever make a decision now which put you into a position one step from now where you couldn't do as well as some other position? Obviously you would never do that if you knew the values of these other positions.
But no matter what the advances in computing were, without this kind of theorem, they'd still be stuck on medium-sized problems instead of large ones.
And the place it's used the most upsets me greatly, and I don't know how Dick would feel, but that is in the so-called quants doing financial engineering, so-called financial engineering, that designed derivatives and brought down the financial system. That's all dynamic programming mathematics, basically. I have a feeling Dick would have thought that was immoral. The financial world doesn't produce any useful thing. It's like poker. It's just a game, and you're taking money away from other people and getting it yourself and things. And to encourage our graduate students to learn how to apply dynamic programming in that area, I think is a sin.
He was trying to teach people over and over again that mathematics is the invention of symbol systems. It's ways of thinking.
In those days, and still, there was a huge snobbery in mathematics in which pure mathematics sneered at applied mathematics. And instead of accepting that and therefore avoiding it perhaps, which he could have done, he had the bravery and the wisdom, I think, to turn his back on that accepted wisdom and to become an applied mathematician. I'll accept the world as it is and see if I can use mathematics to, in some ways, and he tried in a great many ways, to improve the world.
But he would say, I only thought I would be a $15,000 a year mathematician as an associate professor at some university. And then suddenly mathematics became important. It was all a question of timing. You were on your honeymoon in Pearl Harbor. Happened.
From Richard Bellman's Autobiography. Finally, in December of 1944, I was drafted. I remember that Gene Kelly was drafted at the same time and gave us a demonstration of dancing using several tables. I knew if I was going to go to Los Alamos, the only hiking I would do would be between my office and the barracks. However, I could not resist a grandstand play. I drew myself up to full height and said, "Sir, I will do whatever my country requires."
He was what was then called a computer. A computer was a live person at that time. And so he worked on different parts of the mathematics that led up to the A-bomb.
Town atom test measured a model village in the Nevada desert against the awesome power of nuclear energy. Buildings of various materials went up. $1 million worth of equipment was installed, including lifelike mannequins, and tons of food to measure the contamination caused by radiation.
He felt that it was essential to saving American lives. He would always say that there would have been 2 million American casualties if they hadn't dropped the bomb.
He was very excited about working on the A-bomb. He felt that the Germans had an unmarked grave for him, and he really wanted to drop the A-bomb on the Germans, and he was sorry they dropped it on the Japanese, I think.
From Richard Bellman's Autobiography, upon leaving Los Alamos. When I stood at the train station at El Paso, I noticed the restrooms which read white men and colored men. Shades of Nazism, I thought.
He actually would break into hives. He had terrible nightmares. On the other hand, the idea of the Nazis having an atomic bomb was a lot more scary.
I didn't want to build bombs. However, I felt that I owed a debt to society. I knew that my brains had contributed to the war effort more than my brawn ever could. I knew I would not be happy whatever I did. It was a case of damned if I did and damned if I didn't. I imagine many decision makers find themselves in this position. That if it were a choice between the women and children in Pittsburgh and the women and children in Moscow, I would do everything I could for the women and children in Pittsburgh.
He thought he was going to die in the war, and he actually cried to my mother and me about it. He hated the idea of going into the army. I didn't know how he could possibly survive. You know, this is a man who loved classical music, read many languages, including not only Greek and Latin, but
Sanskrit.
I asked him years later how he survived, and he said two things. I talked baseball and I talked sex.
Very good.
You know he loved me. Yeah, he did. I don't know whether you knew that.
He loved what?
Me.
Yes, I did.
He always said I was the smartest woman he ever met, which is his way of praising someone.
From Richard Bellman's Autobiography. I was discharged from the Army on March 1st, 1946, a date I celebrated for 10 years. I went immediately to Princeton. I should have taken a vacation for at least 3 months, but I was anxious to make up for lost time.
He taught a course that had to do, of course, with advanced mathematics for graduate students and postdocs. The other one was an undergraduate course in mathematics for non-mathematics majors. He called it Mathematics for Poets.
For graduate students, he actually was very, very good to us, and we stayed summers a couple of times. We stayed at his house and took care of the house while he was in Europe, and that was always just a great thing for us to be able to come over there and stay in that nice house.
He would tell somebody, you've been working on this problem for 20 years. I have a graduate student who can solve it in 24 hours. Nobody wants to hear that.
He took a graduate student. He didn't look for A students. He wanted kind of a good student, maybe a B average was fine. This is for a graduate program, because he figured A students probably were just, all they're doing is studying. And from his background, he never studied anything unless he was interested in it.
And his students, who adore him for saving their lives and things. I mean, a lot of times he was the one that swung the influence to get them a grant to get them out of their countries and over here. Changed the whole course of their lives.
He was very good to his students. He always treated them well and with a great deal of respect, which you really couldn't say the same for the way he treated his colleagues.
I received a letter from John Nash, who I wrote to at Princeton. I know that he worked with my grandfather there. John Nash of It's a Beautiful Mind wrote me a letter explaining his relationship working with my grandfather. Ever the mathematician, Professor John Nash designated my grandfather like a problem to be solved, designating him Richard XXXX Man.
When he was at Princeton, he had a chance to meet Einstein. My father got so nervous that apparently he went down to the stacks to read during the time that he would wait for Einstein. Well, he lost track of time. So Einstein finally calls my mother at home in Princeton and says, "Doesn't Richard Bellman want to meet me?" I've been waiting for him and he hasn't shown up. And my mother went, "Oh, Professor Einstein, oh, I'm so terribly sorry. He wants to meet you very badly. I know exactly where he is." And so she ran down to the library, guessing that he would be in the stacks. And there she found him in the stacks. She said, "How could you do this? How could you stand up Einstein?" Well, he rushed over and he met Einstein. So I was, listening to this story, and I must have been about 12 or 13 when he was telling me this. And I said, "So what was Einstein like?" And he said, "He was a good physicist." which of course meant that he wasn't a good mathematician. That was just so much like my dad. That kind of amazing arrogance, you know. He was a good physicist.
I haven't been here in over 45 years. We're at 444 Bundy Drive. It was the first house my dad bought in California, in Southern California, when we came down from Stanford. He was a professor at Stanford. We lived in Palo Alto. We had an acre of redwood trees in the backyard, and he would come home and we'd walk around the redwood trees. It was beautiful. I'd play by myself in the backyard and marvel at the animals. And I remember my mom and dad were a golden couple, they're often described as. She was beautiful and he was handsome, and they were both very animated, alive, and full of dreams and hopes for the future.
What did he love?
He loved mathematics.
Mathematics and tennis.
Loved his work.
He loved his work.
Beauty, especially beautiful women.
He was a very interesting, vibrant kind of man, absolutely full of energy.
He was a very good-looking guy.
He was a very tall, physically fit, very handsome man. You know, rather movie star-like. He had a grand stature.
He was not a typical academic. He loved to have fun. He loved to party. He loved to play dumb games.
But he was pretty impressive because he was, both, very, very dynamic speaker, but also, very obviously very strong personality and very much a very physical presence because he was such an athlete.
But I do really remember being very intimidated by his presence and never feeling like, I had really much to say.
He was considered a little arrogant.
An amazing, almost a legend. Really quite prolific in our house. I mean, we have stacks of books and shelves of books that are written by him. It is kind of strange living under that legend. It's kind of like a shadow.
He had a very powerful presence. He was very charismatic, very powerful, and yet he could be tender and gentle at the same time.
I think every little girl probably idealizes, if she has an opportunity, the father figure. The hard part with my dad is that in many cases, my idealization of him was also true. He was really very powerful and famous and dynamic and amazing and charismatic. My experience was one of growing up under a large shadow.
Chess was one way that my dad and I always were able to communicate. He was actually, as everybody knows, a very good teacher. And he taught me chess well. And he would always say structure and then tempo, tempo, tempo. Almost like a composer. The timing is so important in chess. People don't realize that in moves ahead, you get that one move ahead, you can maintain an advantage the whole time. Like a prize fighter has his opponent off balance. As Dad was teaching me the fundamentals, he also taught me a love of the game because it has an infinite variety of abstract types of positions and situations that you can get into. So there's the warring personalities between the opponents, but there could also be a mutuality of artistic composure between two chess players. But of course, in the end game, we both had that killer money player instinct at the end, where if you got down to the end, you played very hard to win.
I knew that he was in love with what became his second wife, Nina, when one day we were playing chess in his office, and Nina appeared at about 5:15, we started at 5, and said, Dick, you promised to take me out for a drink after work. I want to go out for my drink. And Dick said, no, wait till I finish this chess game with Stuart. And Nina said, no, and knocked all the chess pieces on the floor. And my immediate thought was, he'll kill her. Instead of that, he got up and he went out for a drink with Nina. I knew he was in love. Bellman was a powerful looking person and a powerful personality, and very few people ever stood up to Bellman. And when Nina did that, it was quite amazing. And he liked people who did, I think.
Reshevsky was a Russian who was Grand Master, which at the time he was the best chess player in the world. And he came to Santa Monica one year. Dad was up a bishop in the game, and Reshevsky offered him a draw. Now, Grandmaster does not lose to an amateur. He knew that the odds were that Reshevsky could come roaring back and take him out. Although Reshevsky was unsure at the same time if he could or not. So Dad accepted the draw, which was the wisest possible move to make.
When I was a kid, I used to watch my dad play against Richard Bellman, his dad. Chess all the time. Every time we would go over there to visit, they would play chess the entire time. It was constant competition. There was never a word exchanged. And I know that my dad tries a lot to play on the same team as me in some of the video games that we played, and he doesn't always like to play against me. And it's probably because it reminds him of his relationship with his own father.
Gabe, my lad, what would you like for your birthday?
A watch?
Will it be made out of atoms?
Nope.
No atoms?
Nope.
But digits? Lots of digits?
What is it?
Digits are numbers.
Nope.
No numbers?
Yep.
No.
He didn't coddle me. He didn't. He wanted me to be a man in the archetypal image of that generation and stand up for myself on my own. I learned that from him. Not to be a victim. And of course, Kirsty was always a good kid, getting good grades in school during all this time, except when she wasn't. Like when she, was going out with these redneck motorcycle guys, and she tried to break up with one of them, and he refused to, so she called him an asshole, and then he spit on her in school. And then I challenged him to a fight in front of Sweet 16 in Santa Monica there. It was a bad scene for her. 20 people gathered around her in a circle taunting her because she broke up with this guy. So that needed to be handled, and I was the one to do it. And he showed up with 7 of his buddies, and I came up with 4 of mine. I pushed the 7 of them aside and slugged them in the mouth. And they got thrown in a squad car before he could return the favor. And I got put on probation for inciting a riot. But the cops were kind to me too, because he was just some redneck who was already on probation, low-class, white trash trailer guy. Well, I lived above Montana, was son of a famous scientist. Not to mention my dad's security clearance, importance to the state.
I'd always heard that there were a lot of security clearance problems, and that the McCarthyism trials had been really tough on my grandfather.
He was at Los Alamos, and I think it was a technician sort of named Greenglass, who he didn't like, nobody liked, but who found out that Dick and his wife were going back east on a vacation, and asked whether a couple of relatives of his who were coming to visit at that time could use Dick's house. And so Dick grudgingly said yes. I think it turns out that the people who came to visit were the Rosenbergs, and the secret may have been passed on that trip, and maybe even in that house.
We called them the Green Vomits. We had this apartment vacant in Albuquerque, and he got talked into letting the Green Vomits stay there. But later on, it was brought up against your father.
I did a Freedom of Information Act. It took the FBI about a year to respond to my request. He was considered suitable to be turned into a Russian spy by Green Glass and by implication by the Rosenbergs.
Dear Mr. Bellman, the enclosed documents were reviewed under the Freedom of Information Act. 202 pages were reviewed, and 192 pages are being released. I'm wondering what's in those 10 pages they didn't send me. Just the first thing here, December 7th, 1951. Subject, Richard Bellman.
Pages 1 and 3 of this report contain a list of persons compiled by David Greenglass at the request of Julius Rosenberg, whom Greenglass believed to be ideologically suited for recruitment into Soviet espionage, who were employed at Los Alamos.
Jesus.
One of the persons on this list is Richard Bellman, identified with the above captioned subject.
Whoa.
So it looks like they targeted Richard Bellman to recruit him as a spy.
To tie him into the Rosenbergs, who were later executed.
For treason.
Yes, for giving atomic secrets to the Soviets.
And then there's interviews with everyone who ever lived with him. Everybody, his college roommates, his high school friends.
And what do they say?
They all just say he was like a patriot, that he actually loved democracy.
I thought that was so amazingly cruel because your dad was so independent.
Right.
He could never have been a communist of any kind because he could never follow the law that they laid down.
Yeah, he had his own rules.
He had his own.
He was very anti-communist because he thought they were stuck, and he thought the system really didn't allow for free thinking. And
One of the bitterness that Dad held the rest of his life, colleagues of his that he felt like were really, really close friends, were too scared to get McCarthy sort of focusing on them. They didn't speak up on his behalf. And he said that some of the most weird reactionary colleagues that he didn't even like went out on a limb saying, he's a liberal, but he's no commie.
My grandfather discussed this incident in his autobiography. Quote, in those days it was quite a serious charge. It was interesting to see the reaction of various people at Rand. Some avoided me like the plague, and some went out of their way to invite me to parties. I remembered who did what.
that was tough on him. He had he sold his house, and Rand stuck by him, but that was, I think, a really tough time. I remember he was so sad at that time. He looked terrible.
About 1956, 55, he was very concerned about those hearings. He's the only man to ever beat those hearings, and be totally cleared. Once he had his security clearance yanked. Yeah, it's quite a story.
He had done so much. In the Los Alamos project, he described the work conditions. I mean, it made him sick for years. I mean, they worked, 20-hour days, and they worked so desperately to create the atom bomb before Hitler got it. And he cared so much about this country, and he had done so much. And to do all that effort, and then to get this kind of investigation, I mean, it must have just been, it was so painful on so many levels.
So, when he's being investigated by McCarthy, if he loses his security clearance, he goes broke.
It isn't a matter of money. It's a matter of pride.
Pride.
He couldn't even go to the bathroom by himself. He couldn't take out his own papers. But then the FBI would knock on the door and they'd interview me and say, tell us tell your brother. And
what the deal was, Dad told me, eventually, was that he was not allowed to see Uncle Bob or Aunt Ellie or our cousins, that there had to be a split in the family.
Just finished having lunch with my great uncle Bob. Unfortunately, when I asked him if he wanted to be interviewed for the movie, he declined.
too painful.
It's too painful.
It's very hard to talk about some things.
Yes, it is. He taught me a lot about fear and greed in chess. There's one famous gambit in chess called the poison pawn, where if you take it, you lose the game. Ultimately, as it plays out 20 moves later. And if I would fall for one of his gambits by being greedy at what looked like a careless move on his part, then he would look at me and go, greed, nod his head. Winning and losing has always been about greed and panic. And I had a lot of moral instruction in how to win. And Dad loved to win. He taught me to let the opponent catch you bluffing in poker once, so that they would question thereafter whether or not you're bluffing again, and then you could spring the trap on them, which I know you do too.
Your father really is your vision of what you're going to be as a man when you're born. And you may like that or not like that, and it's something you either struggle against or strive towards. Either way, it's a tremendous source of pressure. During the third day of filming, my dad wanted me to erase some of the footage, saying it made him look like too much of an asshole. And I refused, and told him that he had signed a release form, and I pulled out a release form and showed him his signature, giving me complete creative control.
I no longer feel like we can just go on a verbal agreement, though, because I actually need to see in black and white what's going on. I mean, this whole thing with the camera on me, things that I don't want to share. I'm really pissed off still, okay?
Why?
First of all, I feel betrayed by you. Mainly I feel betrayed by you, okay? Get the damn camera off, will you, please? I don't feel like being recorded right now. You're having a control struggle with me.
I'm not having a control struggle, I'm taking control.
Well,
I'm saying that I'm
if you're taking control.
I'm saying I control
That feels like a loss of control to me.
But you never had that control of the content.
I trusted you. I'm sorry.
You can still trust me.
What? For what? You're not putting my heart at ease, okay?
Well, I guess you have to put your own heart at ease. From Richard Bellman's Autobiography. My first visit to the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions was in November of 1962, the day that Kennedy was shot in Dallas. My talk was scheduled for 11 o'clock, and Kennedy was shot at 11:15. My talk should have been canceled, but it wasn't. I have no memory of what I talked about, and I'm sure the audience has no memory either. We were all too busy speculating whether the assassin belonged to the extreme right or the extreme left. Poor Kennedy. All he wanted to do was make love to beautiful women, but his father wanted him to be president.
I was a prodigal son. I didn't follow in his footsteps, and he resented that. And then, when the baby was born, we were all excited.
Which baby?
You.
So they came down to see me, or you brought me down?
I brought you down. They never came up to see you being born. That wasn't important to him. I think that was a loss for him. But he had a very rich, full life. So he may have argued that it was a waste of time.
When I flew from New York and stayed on my dad's couch for
a month back then, and then I continued to make updates to the film over the last 15 years. And ever since that first few weeks of filming, it has taken on this ominous sort of, oh God, the documentary. It's almost like it has become a metaphor for the unresolved tension issues between my father and his father and me. Because my grandfather's dead, there is this inability, there's this sort of deadlock there, and bringing it up with my father is something that I have become more sensitive to not do as I've gotten older, after seeing my father more as a vulnerable human being than as a tough guy. So I no longer want to fight my father, especially after having watched him go through surgery and have stage 4 cancer. Watching him recover and watching his weakness made me appreciate his humanity, and all the more.
He made an interesting point after the interview was over.
What?
He looked at me and he said, "This is the kind of guy that really maybe shouldn't have had kids. That his life was so dedicated to his work, and that it's like, should Picasso have had kids? I mean, how much time would he have had?"
I think since he was a parent, he wanted to be a good parent. And he tried pretty hard.
I love Dad. And I respect what he accomplished. But it's like, your father, tells you, I'm a great general and I'm going to off to fight the wars and I'm going to do it for the sake of the country, and I expect you kids to go along with it.
A lot of people look at their children as an extension of themselves. He didn't. He was more related, I think, to his own projects than he was to children.
It would have helped so much if he had at least validated my reality, even if he couldn't have done anything about it, even if he felt like he couldn't do anything about it. The fact that there was this silence, as if this was an okay situation, was devastating to me. One of the deep pride that Eric and I have is that in some ways you and Ted will never know certain things. And that's really good. We like it that way. I don't mean know in terms of family stories or knowledge. I mean that you don't ever have to suffer certain kinds of things.
Kirsty and my life is full of war stories. There was a guy that follows home from school, from the movies, my mom and Kirsty and I. And he was about a block behind us. He kept walking faster, we kept walking faster. Dad was gone on a business trip. And then our boxer dog, Bonnie, had heard a low growl, and she went after him and tore his leg off. And there's a trail of blood from the backyard all the way up the street, where he dragged himself with his kind of shredded knee until he collapsed on the sidewalk a few paces up above our house. The police came and hauled him off and put our dog to sleep.
I was deeply depressed. I was in the hospital, and I was thinking of ways of committing suicide. And I thought to myself, is there any one decent, beautiful thing in the world I can believe in? Because I felt like there wasn't. It's part of depression, of course. And I turned on the radio, and Mozart was playing. And of course, I love Mozart. And I said, there's something beautiful in the world.
Ultimately, my grandmother and grandfather divorced, and my grandmother remarried to a man named Leonard.
See, Leonard was a weird asshole. Ripped Mom off. Took all her money, took the house. Really sick guy. And
after some uncomfortable questions, Eric and Kirsty finally admitted to me that their stepfather had abused them after Richard Bellman moved out of the house.
He tried to hit me with the head of a lamp one time when I called him an asshole. He swung the lamp at my head, and I ducked, and I threw it right at him, and I broke the armoire glass, and I cut my wrist, and blood was running down my wrist, and she was screaming, Mom was screaming, and I had to leave the house at that point because, you know, first of all, I was bleeding, and second of all, I would have had to kill the guy because we were going at it. And Mom asked me to leave.
I curled up in a little ball. I really did.
She wasn't shocked.
It was just so awful, the whole thing. You know, and then I was left with them. It was really, I was left, my brother, who was my big brother, my protector.
I was.
Had left the house.
I was.
And I was really scared, you know.
I was, dear, because...
And then my dad wouldn't allow me to come over too. I actually asked him if I could come over too and live with them, and he said no, they could only take Eric.
See, I didn't know that because, you know...
Because at the time, Nina didn't like me, so...
Why?
Because Nina didn't like kids.
I never blamed you.
Because, you know, I would have fought him to...
Almost I didn't blame you. Because it's like, you know...
But I was so lost, and they were so, you know, I was suicidal.
So I started sleeping with a tennis racket beside my bed. I had to use it.
After the interview with Kirsty, I was in the car with my dad, and he turned to me and said, you know, you don't understand how hard it is to go back over this stuff. And I said, yeah, I know, I get it. And then I watched him literally go through it again. And it wasn't like he was talking about something. It was like he was 5 years old and he was by himself and his father didn't care about him. It was the first time I'd ever seen my dad seem so weak and vulnerable and childlike. And I began to feel like perhaps this whole project was emasculating to him and to me and to his father. I mean, were we just chopping the legs off of our fathers so that we can be as tall as they are?
This last week has been hellacious. It has not been an active healing due to this movie. It has been a shock of recognition once again of how bad things were. And it suddenly became about going to the heart of darkness. As I go down the river into the heart of darkness, I get drawn more and more into that darkness myself. For me to be thrown back upon my own resources and kind of question what I'm going through. I'm going through midlife too. Death is rushing at me like a freight train. And I'm glad that we could document some things that Dad did, because these are important times. The themes are great.
What are the themes?
The McCarthy era, the kid from Brooklyn who makes good, the atomic bomb.
When you're dealing with someone in your family that's no longer alive, it's hard because it doesn't seem like there's any closure. I'm glad my dad's alive.
Who's this movie about?
It's about your dad. But it's become about you. It's become more about you than your dad. I think you co-opted it. You went in there and you stole his thunder. It's like, he would have appreciated that, I bet.
Turnabout is fair play.
Yeah, exactly. I think he would have enjoyed it.
I think he had a sense of humor too.
Yeah, he would have thought it was funny.
Yeah, he would have.
It's now 7 years later. Still working on this movie. I am living in San Francisco now.
That's a nice little
There it is, Dad.
S'more here.
Here we are again.
Yeah, hi. Life is much better. My mom died, my stepfather died, and I got cancer. I'm so much happier now, 5 years later. I also got GERD and emphysema, but I quit smoking. I got over my mom's death. She was wonderful. And I beat cancer, and life is great. And I'm very much in the moment, and I'm happy. I'm very proud of my family. The moment is wonderful. This is good times.
7 years ago, I had a 16-year-old in the house, and now I have a grown young man's son. People were surprised because I'm such a dedicated professional woman that I found the empty nest difficult. But I did. I found it very difficult. I found it difficult. I really like having kids.
I did think that being a mathematician was part of the family business. And so that's why I went to college, because I was good at math, but also because I liked it. And I thought that was going to be my career.
My cousin Ted, who's now in law school, didn't even remember being interviewed for this movie. When I interviewed him 7 years ago, it's been 7 years since I started this. Here we are. So that's the last of the Bellmans right there.
Yeah. I think the pressure of legacy is a big thing that's both positive and negative. You know, it's made me a lot more ambitious in terms of like striking out a name for myself and carrying on the Bellman glory. But on the other hand, that pressure can be a little suffocating sometimes. I mean, especially because, you know, I was good at math, but I wasn't that good at math. Do you think you're as smart as Dick Bellman?
Let's see, do I think I'm as smart as Dick Bellman? No.
That's like what I just said.
But then again, but then as soon as I say that, I'm like, but that's also because I don't care as much about being smart as he did. He was definitely a Renaissance man. He was an athlete, he was a scholar, he was a socialite, and he was a womanizer, and I think I'm all those things, plus I can play the guitar. Although I may not be as good at any one of them as he was.
But the notion that there are things to be learned, to be understood by thinking about them, sometimes by arguing, but mostly by thinking. That's another quality that I've found in all of the Bellmans that I've had any interactions with, is the notion not just thinking about things that other people don't, but realizing the importance of some of those questions that other people don't. And whether or not you agree with somebody's assessment of the importance of a question, you have to at least recognize that if somebody thinks it's important, it might be.
What do you think his biggest shortcoming was?
His inability to trust people.
I don't know. I don't think of him in terms of shortcomings. I don't even know if it's a shortcoming, but there were some things that that other people will tolerate and put up with and be polite about that he simply wouldn't. And maybe the rest of us ought to be a little more like that. I don't know.
He was not too tolerant of people he didn't like. If he liked you, he loved you. If he didn't like you, you're on the list, you know.
What kind of things did he hate?
Stupid people masquerading as intellectuals.
Pretentious kinds of people.
People that I think that acted stupid, you know, even if they were smart.
Intolerant of things that he didn't care for.
I don't know, he probably was a little arrogant, maybe not as sensitive to other people.
The arrogance was, I think, more out of the insecure little boy. You know, here was this Jewish kid who was making it in a WASP world. When he went to Princeton, he had to pretend that he wasn't Jewish because they had a quota on the number of Jews they would admit.
Probably his biggest shortcoming is being so into that cerebral world that he missed out on the more emotional levels. And even, with his children, spending that time, which I think his son Eric is trying to make up for in his relationship with his son.
In a somewhat parallel process to the way he devoted his life to science, and so has my sister. We have all very much intelligent, obsessive, devoted to our careers and to our work.
When I was much younger, he didn't encourage either one of us to go near mathematics. But then, by the time I was 17 or 18, suddenly he really wanted me to start getting, sort of being an heir to him.
What kind of therapy?
Psychotherapy.
Psychotherapy?
I'm a shrink, yeah.
Oh, you're a shrink. Oh,
I'm a shrink,
okay.
yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was hard for me, as it took so long for my career to become established. And it took me so long to get myself together to become who I am. That it's only now, in my 50s, that I can truly enjoy him and what I've gotten from him and be at peace with that and my own life. I'm a psychotherapist. I've helped people.
What kind of people do you help?
Teenagers, abused women, family therapy, couples therapy, whatever works, which is what I learned from my father. Breathe.
Yes.
Just relieve with tension. Let the energy lift. It's like Mark Twain said, right? When I was 18, my dad was a complete idiot. By the time I was 25, I was amazed at how much he'd grown.
This documentary that I'm making, which is about my grandfather, but it's also sort of the process of this is supposed to be something to bring me closer and to help me understand my father more. The point of this movie is for our relationship and for us to understand ourselves better.
Right. So if there's stress going on, you're looking for jobs, you're wondering where you're going to live, you're wondering where you're going to get a girlfriend. The transitional time in your life. You got through law school. This is a transition for you, is it not?
The parts that worry me are the isolated inability to connect and form real meaningful relationships with people. Those aspects of my grandfather I don't want to embrace.
We fought in the 60s, and I said, you know, this Vietnam War sucks. We're blowing up people over there. We're killing people for no reason. We're napalming them. We're destroying villages. A big fight with him in his grand hall of his house. And we were eating dinner. And he goes, well, so what? Kissinger thinks it's a good idea. There's domino theory. And I said, well, what about love? And he goes, love? What do you mean love? What does love have to do with anything in the world? I said, well, what about love? Because it was all love, peace in those days, John Lennon, all that stuff. And he goes, there's no such thing as love. And I started yelling at him, yes, there is such a thing as love. And he goes, no, there's no love in the world. He says, look what the South Africans are doing to the blacks. Nobody cares. Look what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. Look what happened to the Armenians in the diaspora. He says, there's no love in the world. Love doesn't exist. It's a romantic concept. There's no such thing as love. It's only power and independence. He says the only reason that we want power so we can be independent. The only reason we need to be independent is so that other people cannot attack us. And that's the only reason.
I feel like I almost need to explain that when I first met my grandfather, he was paralyzed and in a wheelchair and spoke in a way that I couldn't even understand a word he said. I knew him as a cripple in a wheelchair, and I was afraid of him. And it's embarrassing to admit now that as a child I did not want to visit him. I was scared of him, and I had no idea that he had been this tremendously successful figure. All I knew was that he made weird noises that I couldn't understand, and he dragged himself around this gigantic mansion and would swim and stuff like that, and play chess with my father.
I said the other night at dinner what a marvelously simple instrument the human mind is. I had found the phrase in an article by Dr. Richard Bellman, a brilliant Rand Corporation mathematician. Brilliant seemed to be an adjective that was used quite a bit.
Here, think machine won't take place of man. Another article by him.
That's wonderful, Aaron.
In the vitally important precaution of dusting each other off, the lowly broom becomes an item of military significance. Next, Geiger counters are used to check the troops for signs of radioactivity.
The tumor was the size of an egg. They used a world-famous surgeon to have it removed. He was not expected to survive the operation. Lived another 10 years after. His heart was going, and they had to make a choice. Wait for the heart to get better while the tumor was growing, or remove the tumor and risk a heart attack. There was no choice. They had to go for it. So they removed the tumor, and he had a stroke on the operating table while in the middle of the operation. And he still survived.
It was really kind of remarkable that he lived, because just about everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong. He had a stroke, he had a heart attack, he had meningitis, he had innumerable infections, he had breathing difficulties so that he had a trach for a long time. Then he got some sort of nervous problem which kept him from swallowing. So he had a tube in his stomach for a long time.
You know, one of the things that impressed me very much was his mind never wavered in all that time. And it was really sad, because he was to see a guy that was such a wonderful athlete and everything, you know, in a wheelchair, and it was very hard.
And at one point, he started doing these sort of spasmodic, what the doctors thought were just spasmodic twitches of his hand. And they said something to me about that, and I said, no, he's practicing. And it's like he was completely paralyzed, but it was like first, whatever he could get to move, he was starting to practice. And then he started doing this. You know, he was getting to the point where he could walk along by holding on stuff. That was like a tremendous triumph.
From Richard Bellman to Eric Bellman, dated May 22nd, 1975. Dear Eric, I am slowly getting better. Probably the biggest change has been in my speech. Although I am still hoarse, it is very much easier to talk, and everybody says that I am much more intelligible. My walking is coming along, and I have high hopes that swimming in the pool will be very good for my coordination. Anyway, it will be fun. It was great to see you, Molly, and Gabriel. I look forward to seeing you all soon. Love, Dad.
He never did walk on his own again, but as long as something was bolted down, he was strong enough so that he could stand. And he looked like he was in really beautiful physical condition. He was very muscular.
One of the ways he told me later that he stayed sane is that he wrote an entire book in his head, and he kind of kept it memorized. Now, it wasn't his best book, but he came out, the moment he could talk, he started out, page 1, chapter 1. You know, he had just basically worked on memorizing a book as an exercise for keeping sane when he couldn't talk and when he couldn't move. Because you can imagine what it'd be like to have a Bellman brain.
and not be able to move.
You know how we Bellmans are. We never stop raging against the dying of the light. You never give in.
We went to the hospital the day after the surgery, and we looked at him. He looked okay, but he was sort of immobilized, couldn't talk, but he pointed to a pen, and we gave him the pen, a piece of paper, and he wrote in very, almost illegible, but he was able to move his hand enough to write, "Assume all is rational."
He didn't plan on dying. And he would swim in the pool 100 laps and work out on the track and the harness and build up his muscles. He did that for 10 years. From my age now, 52 to 62, I don't think he planned to die.
Well, it didn't slow down his productivity. You couldn't tell that he had ever been sick at all from the amount of work that he produced. It just meant that he couldn't play tennis anymore.
But he just had this drive to keep producing. And then I think especially when he was sick and he was handicapped, the stuff that he was turning out then, I guess there were some people helping him, really was bad. And I think a lot of us felt really sad about that.
And even when our relationship was strained, I would always play chess with him on the same board. I missed that connection very much. And he was very gentle in his teaching with me. And I got to the point where I was winning 1 out of 3 games from him, which was no small feat. And his game started slipping. And at a certain point, especially after the operation and everything, he could no longer concentrate in chess. And I think there was a day I beat him so easily that we finally stopped playing together. I wish he hadn't had to go through that.
He said, you shouldn't be afraid of failure. He said, success wasn't really necessary as far as he was concerned. If he had an idea, he'd publish a 1-paragraph paper, and we have it put in a journal someplace. And then he said, if you're wrong, he said, the world will let you know. They did, but he didn't care. He didn't care if he was wrong. He just said, it's an idea. I'll put it out and see what people think of it. He felt that failure was a large part of success.
He learned some things that he would not have ever gotten in any other way. Because he learned that people loved him, really loved him. And he was so humbled by that. Here's this man who was sort of dominant in so many things and was so esteemed, and yet way down deep was a person who was surprised and touched that people wanted to have anything to do with him after he was crippled. It would have been wonderful if he could have been uncrippled during his 50s and 60s, because that is often the time where in the academic and intellectual world where in some sense you get to consolidate all the fruits of one's labor. I think that that's a real loss, really a big loss to mathematics, that he wasn't able to play that role to the hilt. My stepmother called up and said, your father's dead, just like that. So we went to the hospital and we pretended that we didn't know that he was dead. And we walked in and we said, we rushed right away and we heard our father was very sick. Can we see him? And then they all all the hospital attendants went, oh my God, they don't know he's dead. So they didn't want to tell us, and they sort of set us down. They brought him back up from the morgue, put him in a hospital bed, and covered him up, and then told us that he was dead, and then let us go in and see him. So we were able to say goodbye. When he died, his hair was still very, very black. A little white, just a little white. And his expression was so peaceful. He was finally at peace. He hadn't looked that peaceful. I think maybe any time I'd ever seen him. He was lying there, and his face looked beautiful. And sort of this driven person was finally not driven.
I think I've learned about myself in the making of this film, and I've also learned about my father and his father.
He flew up to San Francisco one time just to watch me at a protest. I remember walking by him and seeing him standing there, watching. But I didn't go up to him. I just let him sit there by himself. He must have been about 19. So I think he wanted to understand. I feel bad that I didn't go up to him and talk to him. But I was very alienated in my own world at the time.
Why didn't you go up to him and talk?
He was sitting there on top of the car. I walked right by him. He told me later he'd done that, but I was never sure whether he'd done that to show that he was thoughtful in terms of looking at both sides of the Vietnam War, like Kissinger, the philosopher statesman, or he wanted to connect with me on some level. But now, if I wish he was still alive, I would go sit in the car with him and talk. You know. Let's walk right by him. He's in Berkeley.
There he is. He's filming us. He's testing sound quality and picture quality. How's the sound quality?
It's good.
All right, how's the picture quality?
It's pretty good.
Will we get more light in the other corner?
Yeah. If Richard Bellman were still alive and you could ask him something or say something to him, what would it be, and could you say it as if you were speaking to him?
Do you think set theory makes any sense as a foundation for mathematics? Or language? I'd really like to hear an answer to that one.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, Dick, let's set up a poker game for Tuesday night, and we'll have some, I'll get the old gang together, we'll have some fun.
Well, here we are in the Grand Canyon with my father on his 63rd birthday. Happy birthday, Dad.
Thanks, son.
You're 63. 10 years ago, you wished me happy birthday, and that was just the beginning of this project. It's now almost finished, and I get to wish you a happy birthday. If he lives another year, he'll outlive my grandfather, and then that'll be a really good birthday for both of us.
Yeah, because outliving my dad was always one of my great dreams in life. It's the last thing I wanted to do. I mean, yeah, no, actually, no, it wasn't the last thing. Well, it would be the last thing I would do, wouldn't it?
It would be the very last thing.
Yeah.
When you did.
That I would actually willfully